Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies at UC Berkeley, and on behalf of the University of Chile, the School of Economics and Business. This is part of a series the University of Chile and Berkeley are doing on inequality, a dialogue across the Americas. The issue of inequality in the United States is a central one at this moment, with an election upcoming, with broad concerns about the economy. It is clearly also a central concern in Chile and really throughout the Americas. This is the second of a series that we are doing. The first was in early September with former President Ricardo Lagos of Chile and Robert Reich from here at Berkeley. Today, I'm going to introduce both our speakers, one in Berkeley, one in Chile, and then we will, each of the speakers, after brief opening presentations, will ask a question of the speaker in another country, in fact, on another continent, and then we will open for questions here at Berkeley, at the University of Chile, and several that we've received on the internet. I'm very pleased that we have with us today Professor Brad DeLong of UC Berkeley. He's in the economics department here at Berkeley. He's the chair of the political economy of industrial societies major, and he's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy under President Clinton. And he's one of the most widely read, thoughtful, bold, and provocative, all of the above, bloggers and tweeters that is observing the economic scene today. After he speaks, I'm very pleased that we will have Professor Oscar Landerretche, who is also the director of the School of Economics and Business at the University of Chile. He is an editorial columnist for a Chilean daily, La Tercera. We have two, I think, really informed and thoughtful people with us, so please join me in welcoming Brad DeLong.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always happy to be here at the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm even happier to be part of a cross-continental dialogue, if only because the slow creation of, call it a global intellectual space, is what ought to be the 21st century mission of universities like this. That after all, 1,000 years ago, when the university starts in the West, it had started earlier elsewhere, the basic problem was that you needed educated people. Emperors needed judges. Popes needed theologians. Theologians and judges need to have and read books, but books are expensive. Come 1100 or so, when the University of Bologna is founded, your average book requires about 6 months of skilled monk labor to produce by the time you've prepared the parchment, prepared the ink, written out the book, illustrated the manuscript, and so forth. Much, much cheaper to get all the budding judges and theologians together in a room in Bologna or Naples or Paris or Oxford and have somebody read the single copy of the book that exists to them aloud while they take notes, than to have people distributed all over Western Europe, each with their own copy of these hideously expensive books. Well, books are much cheaper now, but we still have universities because they are places where people can come together and easily talk to each other about important intellectual issues and principles. And we would have a better world if we could generalize this to the globe. So the entire globe becomes one university, rather than being small individual hotspots all over the place to which a relatively small proportion of the world's population has access. That's the business we're in for the 21st century. That's the business that this particular technology experiment is in aid of. And with that commercial for interdisciplinary distance learning and engagement, let me note I've used up a third of my introductory time already and shift to inequality. 3 dimensions of inequality. Global inequality between nations. The fact that the technologies of the Industrial Revolution, which are now the common heritage of all humankind, have been successfully implemented much more in some parts of the world than in others. And up until 1975, I would say that the gap was growing. That the rich North Atlantic plus Japan was successfully adapting these technologies extraordinarily rapidly, but that by and large the rest of the world was adopting these technologies significantly more slowly, so that the relative gap, at least, between the North Atlantic core and the rest was in almost all cases growing extremely rapidly, with the southern cone of South America playing a somewhat unique and puzzling role that seemed to change from decade to decade. Since 1975 or so, we're much more optimistic because our statistics about global inequality have shown rapid increases in equality over the past 30 years, have shown an end to the 1800 to 1975 trend of rising inequality, whereby if you pick 2 people at random across the globe, they're more unequal at later dates than earlier dates. Potential problem is that this is entirely due to good growth performance in 2 countries, China and India, that they've had good generations. Will they continue to have good generations? We hope so. Should we have confidence from the fact that these 2 countries have had good generations? Well, maybe we should. They're 40% of the human race. 40% of human beings are now used to economic growth and will demand it of their political leaders. On the other hand, it's just 2 countries out of 170. What if they fall back and the next 2 countries to experience growth miracles over the next generation are, say, Jamaica and Bermuda? The overall statistics won't look nearly as good. All right, so that's one dimension of inequality, global inequality. The second dimension of inequality, let me turn to the United States as a whole, to the coming of the second Gilded Age. That is, we used to have a nice framework for understanding the time dimension of inequality in the United States. It starts out as a country that's relatively equal, at least among white guys who speak English. Free land, lack of serfdom, possibility of moving to the West if you don't like the wages you're being offered in the cities. And then come 1870 or so things shift as the frontier closes, as technologies become more capital intensive, as we move into a world of plutocrats and merchant princes on the one hand, and of people fresh in the cities, either off the farm or for overseas on the other, finding that they're competing against each other for jobs. And you get the extraordinarily stark widening of American income inequality up until the mid-1920s or so, which calls forth a political reaction. Call it progressivism, call it social democracy, call it socialism in Europe. The idea that the government needs to put its thumbs on the scale heavily to create an equal income distribution and a middle-class society seizes power in democratic countries in spite of everything you can say about Gramscian hegemony and the ability of money to speak loudly in politics. And from 1925 to 1980 or so, we see substantial reductions in inequality in the United States, along with substantial promotions of income inequality among groups who had previously simply been cast completely outside the circle of white guys who spoke English. Then in 1980, things shift again. And since 1980, we've had an extraordinary explosion of inequality in the United States along 2 dimensions. First, an extraordinarily rapid growth between, say, the top 20% and the lower 80%, as the benefits to achieving a college education skyrocket for reasons that I don't really have time to go into, and for reasons that are still somewhat uncertain. Second, an even larger explosion of inequality between the top 0.01%. Call it the top 15,000 household, no, the top 150,000, no, I was right the first time, the top 15,000 households in America, and the rest of the top 20%, which is perhaps the most puzzling and remarkable feature of the past generation or so. And I think it puts the American political system under substantial long-term threat, if only because equality of opportunity in the next generation will require substantial equality of result in this generation. And a world in which Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney puts his wealth in a blind trust, but that blind trust then decides, just as a matter of chance, that what it should do is it should take young Tag Romney, someone with no experience running a hedge fund whatsoever, and give him enormous investments to play with. That's not a society where you can think is fulfilling a democratic commitment to equality of opportunity at all. And third, there's the question of how does this generalize across nations? Are we indeed producing not just a plutocratic overclass in the United States, but a transnational global plutocratic overclass? How many of the bond purchases by the People's Bank of China over the past generation will wind up in the hands of the children of Chinese party leaders living in Gstaad or Monaco or Beverly Hills in 10 or 15 years ago? How is social democratic politics and equality of opportunity going to be attainable in a world of the future in which we know that money speaks loudly in politics, but plutocracy seems to acquiring so much money that it may speak very loudly indeed? And let me stop there so we can have a dialogue rather than a lecture.
Thank you. That was a superb beginning, and also we very much appreciate you stressing the unique path-breaking nature of this moment, and here is that path-breaking nature. I'm turning it over to Professor Oscar Landerretche in Santiago, Chile.
Hi there, Harry. Can you hear me? Harley? Okay, let's start then. First, I would like to thank the University of Berkeley, Harley Shaken and Brad DeLong for this opportunity. I agree completely with the idea that that we have to do more of this sort of thing to get our faculties and our students to interact on these matters. I think this is a very interesting, let's say, comparative way of dealing with inequality because of the enormous differences that Chile and the United States have that are very obvious. From the viewpoint of the Chilean economy, of a small, open, emerging economy, we have, of course, a unmoved mover of inequality, which is global inequality trends. And as Brad DeLong pointed out, if in Chile we managed to make our country the most equal country in the world, it probably wouldn't affect global trends because we're very small. So we just have to take those global trends in a way, and we are affected by them in different ways depending on our relationship with the rest of the world. And the thing is that Chile is one of the most open countries and has been for a long time one of the most open countries in the world. So that's the unmoved mover of inequality for us. But of course, that's not all. A country is not only its trade and its and the relative prices that it brings. There's also at least 5 different dimensions in which this inequality plays out. The first, and which is the favorite of most people talking in public issues, is the distribution of productivity and education. The second is the distribution of bargaining capabilities. The third is the economic structure of the economy, what you produce. The fourth is your tax structure, and the fifth is your transfer and entitlement structure. These 5 dimensions determine the answer to the question, how do we participate in world inequality? Or if you prefer, what is our inequality share, a quota, right, in the world? These 5 dimensions, you have to address them simultaneously. And if you look at, for example, the Chilean experience during the last years, you will see that, well, as world inequality has increased during the last few decades, although that trend has reversed because of the things that Brad pointed out, but as this has happened, the Chilean economy has become more and more open. During the last 20 years, it's become even more open than it was before. And if you look at the distribution of education, what we've had is an expansion in quantity and coverage of education, but not really quality. But the numbers do show that that has had a little bit of an impact, because even if you have relatively low quality education, if you expand it a little, of course you achieve something with that. You've had basically no change in the distribution of bargaining capabilities at all. You've had basically no change in the tax structure. You've had, in the economic structure of the economy, you've basically had what, if not a Dutch disease, you could call what I've called here a Chilean sort of flu, or it's not a full throttle, Dutch disease, but we have had an effect of the commodity price boom, of course, on our economy. And where we've seen more action is on the transfer and entitlement structure, where there's been substantial expansions for the last, basically the last decade or so, and that's been very important. But the other ones haven't been that important. So what's been the result of this? In the context of world income inequality basically becoming worse, what we've seen is that if you look at autonomous income inequality in Chile, it's become mildly worse, a little bit worse. And if you look at total income inequality in Chile, that is autonomous income inequality plus the efforts that the state makes with its social programs, entitlements, and transfers. And in the case of Chile, the tax code does not play a role here because it's basically neutral in distributive terms. Total income inequality has become a little bit better, just a little bit. Now, if you look at these two things, autonomous income inequality becoming a little bit worse and total income inequality coming a little bit better, you could argue that that's a pretty good result given what's going on in the world, maybe, given that you're a very, very open economy. And if you value economic openness, and there's good reasons to value it for a small economy, then you could argue, well, the counterfactual could have been much, much worse. So that's one sort of argument you can have on inequality trends in Chile. If you don't value economic openness, then you could have had more aggressive results, maybe, and that's what maybe you're observing in other Latin American countries like Brazil and Argentina, which are not so open and can therefore, with not very, very much more aggressive policies, achieve a little bit more in terms of income inequality in these last basically 10 years. But the question is, why can't we move more aggressively? Why isn't it possible to advance more aggressively? Considering that it's very important to advance more aggressively because we are in one of the world's most unequal regions. The Economist has just pointed out that it's one of the regions that's improving, but it's improving from being the worst. So, there's a long way to go to get really cheerful. about inequality in Latin America. So why can't we move more aggressively? And I would say that these 5 areas of policy, you know, education, labor, economic structure, what you produce, what sectors lead your growth, tax structure and transfer entitlements, all have major stakeholders and losers that you're going to affect, while, you know, the winners in redistribution are usually abstract and diluted. So that makes it very complicated to articulate a political strategy that sustains public policy efforts to increase equality. I think that's the main thing we're facing here in Chile, and part of the social conflict, I would say, that we're living with here in our country has to do with the country sorting out a strategy to get these things together in some sort of policy, and it's very hard because you know, public discussion doesn't have many dimensions. Now, in a way, just to finish, I would say that it's not very different from what one observes in the United States in a way. I mean, just to, let's say, provoke a bit of discussion, if you look at Obama's first term, you know, program or manifesto, I don't know how we should call it, one could say there was some idea of modifying the relationship of the United States with the world economy. There were some proposals of, say, treating differently in tax terms firms that invested abroad or stayed in the States. There was some rhetoric about that, probably had no real policy effect. In education, there's been very little, some efforts, but small efforts. In economic structure, there's been a lot of talk about the green economy, blah, 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 but it's very hard to get something really significant going, except maybe what happened in Detroit, which was a specific bet, not on a new sector, but on bringing back an old one, very successfully, it seems. In tax structure, it remains to be seen. In bargaining power, in labor relations, I believe there's not much there, but there is some effort in changing sort of bargaining power with financial reform, so not in labor issues, but in consumer financial issues. And in transfers and entitlement, there has been some efforts in the health reform issue. So I think it's very similar what happens in a sense, despite the fact that it's two very different countries in two very different moments of development. It's very similar in the sense that for the current democratic administration, it's very hard to coordinate efforts in all these areas. And the problem is that you really need to coordinate efforts in all these areas, because if you want to do education reform, you have to talk about economic structure. If you want to do economic structure reform and have new sectors and develop new areas of production, you need to talk about bargaining in the labor market and tax structure and etc. So the relationship between all these areas is a very complicated political issue. And my view is that over there and over here, people who are worried about income distribution, whatever the reason, if they're worried because they value income distribution in itself, or if they're worried because they believe that very unequal societies may be very unstable and not very sustainable in terms of growth, whatever the reason, it seems that this relationship between the public policy issues and challenges and democratic politics working to relate all these different areas is not working very well, and it seems to be increasingly hard to do. So I think that we're facing a very difficult set of challenges to address this problem, and well, we'll see during the next couple of years if we manage to do it. So I'll leave it there so we can have a conversation.
Clearly, inequality is a critical issue in Chile, in the United States, in fact, in North America, and in South America. So, Brad, do you have a question for Oscar?
Okay. Yes, let's focus on education. That is, my teachers, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, make an impressive and largely convincing argument that the trends in inequality between the top 20% and the bottom 80% in the United States, at least, have been overwhelmingly driven by the race between technology and education, in which technology has kept running at more or less a similar pace. But it's education that has not. It's education that has shifted. That from, say, 1920 to 1980 or so, the United States essentially followed the recipe of Berkeley Chancellor Clark Kerr, that the United States ought to provide as much education for free to its citizens as they wanted. And devotees of the right approved of this policy. Say, people who believe Ayn Rand and have read The Fountainhead a few too many times, or Atlas Shrugged a few too many times, think that that's a way that you can allow strivers to strive and attain the eminence that they deserve. People on the left noted that if you make education free, you get an awful lot of educated and well-trained people, and so the return to human capital goes down. The education premium that those who have been to college and have been trained in the professions can demand for their skills becomes a lot lower. And as your accountants and lawyers and doctors are facing competition in the labor market, and so able to demand lower salaries, that leaves more money for the assembly line workers and the janitors and the home health aides and the nurses and the waitresses. Now, around 1980, this strategy of equality through education in the United States breaks down. And since then, the costs of higher education have been rising at an extraordinarily rapid pace in the United States as government subsidies are withdrawn, and also the universal commitment to pre-college high-quality education has been in decline as well. So without a major change in American political economy, this road that appears to have been very effective at promoting equality between the 1920s and the 1970s is now closed to us. Is the same road open to Chile now? Or if not, why not?
Okay. Yes, I think that actually Chile is becoming, in the last couple of years, a very dramatic experiment for what you're saying, because the short story is the following. During the last 10 years, in Chile universalized access to higher education through a very aggressive credit policy, very expensive and not very well designed, but accessible. I mean, everybody went into university. So if you look at Chile 10 years ago, basically, or a bit more maybe, 12 years ago, you'll see that, we have 15, 16 million people. We had 200,000, 300,000 people studying in universities, technical colleges, etc. And now we have 1.2 million. That's a very big change for very few years. And the problem is that this generation of kids that have entered university, some of which are sitting here with me, have a perception, especially in let's say lesser universities, that newer ones that are not so proven, have the perception that the returns to that are not there in a way. There's a study by a conservative think tank, a sort of equivalent of the Heritage Foundation over there, that estimated that around 40% of the careers being offered by the higher education system have a negative net present value in income terms, not even anything else, just net present value negative right now. So in a way, the assumption that's been applied here in a way is that you're going to fill the market with all these professionals, and some way the economy is going to create the jobs for them. So it's sort of a radical supply side, sort of very aggressive thing, where what you're doing is you're not making capital very cheap like the classical sort of Reaganomic supply side, but you're making human capital extremely available in a way, supposing that the quality is is acceptable. and somehow magically the economy is going to create all these jobs for lawyers and anthropologists and designers that you don't have in an economy that's very centered in commodities. So I think that we're not, the problem with Chile is that we don't have the economic structure to absorb those years that the United States had with that policy. We don't really have it. So in a way, the assumption is that it's going to endogenously create that sort of space, and it remains to be seen. And actually, it's the complicated thing is that even 10 years into this, so it's very recent, the perception by these kids that it's not working. I mean, many of them have these expensive loans. They come out to the market and they feel that, they don't have an employment. So we're going sort of in the direction of what you see in Buenos Aires and Havana, very sophisticated taxi drivers that would be very interesting to drive around with, but very frustrated and very, very, very angry politics, right? We're going right in that direction. So I think that's sort of I think that once again, in a way, Chile is experimenting, or it has experimented already, with a very, very radical sort of approach to higher education. And well, I believe it's not going to work. So we have to sort of change gears in a way. That's my view.
Israel did it in the 1990s, managed to reconfigure its place in the European division of labor to accommodate a population that suddenly became much, much more educated, and did so to a remarkable degree very quickly. And Israel is not that much smaller an economy than Chile. On the other hand, distance matters a lot. And to be very close to the centers of Europe when you want to sell the products of your most highly trained and educated workers to them is a lot easier than when you have the 15-hour flight from Santiago to Los Angeles. It's not that long. It's 12 hours.
It only seems like 15 hours.
Yeah. So it may be that Chile will be the first country to overinvest in higher education. And from our perspective, it will be interesting to watch. From your perspective, there's rather more at stake.
Indeed.
Oscar, you can comment on that, and then please ask a question of Brad.
Yeah, well, I think that what we're living here is sort of the endogenous way. We're sort of working our way into some strategies to get this to work, actually. And what we're seeing is that we need to be very aggressive in all these areas that I was mentioning. And one of the reasons that makes our story a bit different maybe from Israel or other countries is that we also have the issue of Dutch disease here. I mean, it's not exactly Dutch disease, but it's very close to being Dutch disease in a sense. So it's very hard because at the same time you're making all these 1 million kids available with all their degrees and their studies, you have this really amazing booming, well, for us, copper prices and foodstuffs, which have had very, very clear consequences. I mean, it's very, you can see what basically happens with the exchange rate cycle and new sectors appearing. It's very, very clear. And that makes it very, very hard. So yeah, we have to sort of work our way around that. And I was curious about a parallel with the US actually, because the US is a big economy, but in a way it seems to me that, well, you haven't really had you don't, of course, haven't had a Dutch disease with a commodity, but in a way, I sort of feel that what's happened with the financial and services sector, from the viewpoint of the classical industrial sort of economy in the United States, is basically a Dutch sort of disease thing. You have this big shock in a sector that, makes everything very expensive for everybody else. And sort of in a way, you're sort of living this sort of weird sort of version of the same thing, and dealing with the sort of the social consequences, sort of the white, angry, middle-aged, sort of industrial worker that becomes, goes into the Tea Party, of course. I mean, this sort of this sort of dynamic has been seen in other countries, and I was just wondering how that affects sort of the political discussion on inequality, because it seems to me that the same happens in Chile, that we have this enormous copper price that you really have to make an enormous effort to fight against it if you want to have other sectors. It seems to me that the financial sector in the US is not going to go away anywhere, and the services, I mean, it's just going to be a very, very important sector, and this is going to continue to pressure the rest of the structure, and it doesn't seem to me that the government will be able to replicate the efforts it made, let's say, in Detroit by the Obama administration, in many other places. So I don't know what you think. I mean, how plausible it is to face that dilemma.
Brad?
Well, our technical masters want me up at the podium for here on the grounds that the camera angles are better. With respect to the copper disease or the phosphate disease, I mean, the people who actually know about it in the offices to the left and the right of me do strongly recommend the Norwegian model. Large sovereign wealth funds invested abroad, funded and financed by a government that is willing to say that this is your great-grandchildren's inheritance. This is why we're doing this. This is the way to have a stable and well-functioning economy now, and also to pile up wealth for the future. It's been very successful for Norway. I think it's certainly worth considering for Chile. As for the bigger question, I think yes. Over the past generation, the US government has decided, more or less by accident, in the same way that Britain decided by accident to conquer 2/3 of the world around 1750, has decided that it wants to shift 7% of GDP out of manufacturing and other sectors and into what the market was telling us were the sectors of the future. So we shifted 3% of GDP into healthcare administration and 4% of GDP into finance. Now, at the time, we noticed that shifting an extra 3% of GDP into healthcare administration was a big mistake, because what the extra 3% of people working in healthcare administration are doing is that they're working for insurance companies trying to find ways not to pay for the treatment of sick people. So they're not only not producing anything useful, in the sense that the total useful output of medical care and other necessary, convenient, and luxurious commodities would be the same without them, but they're also increasing risk and fear for people who are scared that if they do go to the doctor, they then will not understand the bill they get and will not be able to pay it, and they'll get nasty phone calls for the next 30 years and will be unable to buy a house. We still have a $3 dispute with North California Radiology that's impacting our credit rating, and we are not terribly happy about this. There's also a 4% increase in the share of GDP going to finance. And this also is surely a zero or a negative sum game. That is one of Mitt Romney's big backers. I'm picking on Mitt Romney more than usual today. I'm not quite sure why. At any event, one of his big backers is Anthony Scaramucci, a Wall Street mogul who thinks that what the world really needs is for less regulation of Wall Street and more room for Anthony Scaramucci to go about his business. His business is charging people 1% of their wealth each year so he can tell them which hedge fund will do best over the next year. Now, if Anthony Scaramucci actually knew which hedge fund would do enough about hedge funds to know which one would do best over the next year, he would be making even more money by running a successful hedge fund. He would be competing with Renaissance or Bridgewater, and he'd be up there as someone who was making money for his clients rather than taking their money by having them invest in one particular hedge fund. He doesn't know anything. He's just in a position where lots of people who want an expert to tell them what to do, have been told by their friends that he is the expert to tell. So as near as I can see, the extra 4% of US GDP devoted to finance, that what it's doing is it's taking money not so much from the bottom 80%, but from the rest of the top 10% that wants to know where to put their money, and asks Wall Street for advice. And in one way or another, through price pressure, through arbitrage, through fees, through whatever, this 4% of the American economy, once again, doesn't add anything productive, but does increase uncertainty for the same set of baskets of useful commodities that are out there. So we've moved 7% of the US economy into activities that are at best completely unproductive. And now we have to figure out how to move them out over the next 10 years or generation. And at the moment, we're unable to do so because we're still fighting the lesser depression, trying to keep it from turning into a middle or a greater depression. And any advice as to how to deal with our short-run problems so we can then turn to the long-run problem of structural adjustment would, I think, be very welcome.
Now we're going to open it up to questions from both audiences. If we could start perhaps with a question from Chile to either of the speakers.
Okay, who has a question? I think you have to press, somebody has to press a button. Dale. We have a question.
Okay.
Your side is muted.
Okay. This is where you want signs.
Okay, do you hear me now? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so here goes the question. I would really like to know from Brad what are the prospects that he sees for inequality in the US. In other words, what are the drivers for equality in the United States as we look ahead, if we're optimistic, let's say. And then to what extent does the pursuit of more equality in the US is limited or constrained by global forces? In other words, by the fact that the US has to be competitive in the global economy, or by the fact that there are other kinds of power pressures for the US being a big power, and so on.
Yes. This is, I think, an argument from my old teacher, Richard Freeman, about how in the 80s and 90s, effectively 2 billion workers were added to the potential global manufacturing workforce. The developments of communications, of trade, the coming of the container, the coming of the internet, policy reforms in China and India, and people's confidence that these would persist. These meant that businesses all around the world, wondering where to locate manufacturing, were now confident that they could, if they wanted to, if it made sense, draw on a labor force that was 2 billion bigger. And in that context, the fact that the United States had a lot of highly skilled manufacturing workers who had an immense productivity edge over elsewhere was no longer an effective factor in world production, and that an awful lot of the rise in inequality in the United States between 1980 and today in 2012 is the result of this global pressure on the American economy. Back in the mid-1990s, when I was working for the Clinton administration, I wrote a bunch of memos about how this was then nonsense. That is, it was simply too small to matter. Since the mid-1990s, it's become significantly larger, but I'd say it's still in third place as far as the increase in US, or the fourth place as far as the increase in US inequality is concerned. That is, in first place, has been the education factor. The fact that the United States is no longer clearly the most educated country in the world, and the education system is no longer putting downward pressure on wage inequality. Second place is the shift in the tax and transfer system. The fact that our tax and transfer system as a whole is less progressive than it was a generation ago. And in fact, it's regarded as Kenyan Muslim socialism to even return taxes on the rich back to their levels of the Clinton administration. And don't laugh too much. It really is, right, that the bar for what communism is has been significantly lowered. It's back to Bill Clinton. Third are the social, structural, and economic changes that allow the princes of Wall Street and the plutocrat CEOs to successfully charge what they do charge. That say, if this were 1960 or so, and George Romney, as head of American Motors, proposed for himself the kind of pay scale that the presidents of GM and Ford get today, you would have seen an immediate explosion from the part of the UAW. The UAW would have been out there striking everything and closing down the entire US auto industry within 16 hours. And the outsized CEO pay package would have been strongly revoked, along with those for the juniors competing for the future CEO job. That no longer happens. And that, plus the willingness of the upper 10% to pay extraordinary amounts for advice as to what their investment should be, is, I think, largely a social cultural change. And that I would call is third. And global pressures are fourth. They're there, but they're not half. They're more like 10% of a process. And with 10% of a process, we can deal. And should be dealing, and should in fact be willing to deal, because we still are the most favored nation by luck and history, and we thus have responsibility to manage the international system as a whole, to be, say, the importer of last resort for countries that are trying to develop by building up their own industries.
Now we'll have a question from here in Berkeley. For either, we just need to get the microphone. Oh, yes. Does anyone have a question for either Oscar or Brad? Then I have, here's a question over here, and then I have an internet question, but why don't we take your question and wait one moment till we get you the microphone.
Hello. This question is for Oscar. You mentioned that you were asking why Chile cannot move more aggressively to improve its inequality issue. And you mentioned that the winners are pretty much more abstract, while the losers are pretty evident and they have real interest, they have real stakes in this business. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, and on what other issues are hindering the advance of further equality in Chile?
Sure. So what I see is that the context of this is that Chile has always been a very unequal society, which is a striking difference with the United States, which has had historical periods of relative equality. So if we were to, let's say, if somebody came up with the magic policy formula and actually managed to improve, let's say, our Gini coefficient by 15 points or something like that, 20 points, which is what we would need to become something like a European country, the structure of the economy would be very, very different. I mean, in every single sense, it would be extremely different from what we have today. You would have to have other economic sectors that do not exist right now. You would have to have a different political structure, and you would have to have a different labor structure, a different education system. So it's very uncertain who's going to come up winning and losing in that scenario. See, so it's very hard to promise someone, you know what, we're going to do these things, that are going to make dramatic changes in our economy, and you're going to come up a winner, or you're going to be relatively a winner. It's very hard to make that promise, because a lot of the things we have to do have to really answer questions like, what else are we going to produce apart from commodities, foodstuffs and copper? What else are we going to produce? Which way to go? Are we going to go, let's say, a Norwegian style strategy like Brad suggested? Are we going to go a different one, Australian style? Are we going to go Spanish style? I don't know. What are the and depending on what sectors are going to come up first, what are these new sectors, the structure of the economy and society is going to be very different. On the other hand, the losers are very clear. I mean, Chile is a very small country. Its markets are very concentrated. It's basically controlled by just a handful of very large family conglomerates, and they're going to lose. And it's easier for the losers to coordinate their strategy to defend what they have than the winners. The winners don't really know who they are. It's very theoretical. It's sort of an abstract notion, and all these abstract notions usually get defeated in politics, unfortunately. So that's what I think. I think that it's a very difficult political agenda to actually produce.
We have time for one more brief question from each country. And then, if the questions and the answers are brief enough, I'd like to ask both our speakers to make very brief concluding remarks, an idea that you'd like to leave everyone with on the themes we've been discussing. So is there a question from Chile?
Question from Chile? Over there we have it.
Hello there.
The microphone.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. If we agree with the statement that political structure defines the economic structure, and if we agree in a second statement, which is that our countries, Chile at least, is losing the battle against inequality, do you think we should? Do you think that in the economic discussion is enough for winning this battle, or we should start thinking about some political changes in the way politics and economics dialogue? When we said that, when you said money is have too much power, you can't defeat money. Are you thinking about? Are you having this discussion today in the United States?
Not very constructively, with the Supreme Court especially playing an extraordinarily unhelpful role, and with moderate Republican senators who had been advocates of campaign finance reform and campaign funding equalization in the past, falling in line most recently to follow their particular party line in spite of their expressed policy preferences. When Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute was here last June, he gave an extremely bitter discussion of the disappearance of the Republican moderates. I would say first, it's not clear to me that Chile is losing the battle against inequality. That if you want to say, it's as if that there's a marathon and somebody has completed all 26 miles of the marathon and somebody else is kind of still at the starting line in the river. But they're at the starting line in the river because the combination of the latifundia history of Chile and also the dictatorship have done to them what they used to do to Houdini, have tied them in chains and buried them in the sea, locked in a box. And the fact that Chile has managed to untie itself from the chains of latifundia, get out of the box, and actually swim to the river and reach the starting line, is, I think, an impressive historical achievement, given the way it looked like the world was going back, say, a century and a little more ago. As to changing political structures, And as to reducing the influence of money and politics, the answer has got to be yes, but the answer has got to be to move extremely, extremely cautiously. That there is some truth to the statement that the true will of the people, if the people knew what they ought to know about the political destinies and programs of the parties they vote for, would not be what's reflected in the voting polls in any election day. But if the 20th century proves anything, it's that the people who are loudly, stridently saying, we know the will of the people better than the people's elected representatives are. We are the true representatives of the people, and the people they have elected are the false representatives, that those people are very dangerous indeed.
Is there a question here at Berkeley? I have a related question that came over the internet. Oh. I have a related question that we will conclude with and then ask both our speakers for very brief concluding comments. We will start after that with Oscar and then go to Brad. And before getting to this last question, I just want to remind everyone that Wednesday afternoon, Pacific time, we will have a video of this discussion, of this dialogue, on the website of the Center for Latin American Studies, CLAS.berkeley, berkeley.edu. And this question is from someone who is a professor at UC Berkeley, but also a Chilean, so it combines both countries for our final question. Given the growing inequality in the U.S., how do you explain the lack of social outrage in the country? Is it that people are not aware, are indifferent, or find this level of inequality acceptable and deserving? I think that's probably for you, Brad.
Oh dear. So the question, I suppose, if you want to sharpen the question and give it historical context, it's that during the Gilded Age of the 1890s and 1900s, you had strong political movements saying something is going remarkably wrong with this, that this isn't the country that we thought we were going to live in. The way that historian Roy Ginger, two absolutely brilliant books, Altgeld's America and The Age of Excess, put it, that even the Republicans thought that they wanted to live in Abe Lincoln's America, where everyone, when they're young, splits rails and goes to law school at night and becomes a lawyer and becomes successful and then frees the slaves. That kind of world in which even if you're a son of a penniless and not very successful rural farmer, you can grow up to be president and free the slaves, was the country they wanted to live in. And they found they weren't. And so as a result, you had two political movements, a kind of democratic left, farmer, labor, semi-socialist, populist movement on the one hand, and a mixed democratic, Republican, urban, progressivist movement on the other, both of which were desperately eager to change America, to repair the flaws of the Gilded Age and to make the economy work for everybody, or at least for every white guy, with granting women the vote. In fact, so much so that someone like Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, who was as aggressively partisan an animal as you would ever see, that his loyalty to the Republican cause was always second to his loyalty to, call them progressive principles for American reform. And he was happy denouncing Democrats as communist anarchists, but equally happy denouncing rich Republicans as malefactors of great wealth who desperately needed to control, who wove a nice political career between being head of the Republican Party and head of the progressivist movement, until at the end, when Republican President Taft simply offended him one time too many, he decided to blow up the Republican Party and hand the presidency to Woodrow Wilson for 1912 to 1920 on the grounds that a progressive Democrat was better than an unprogressive Republican. That was the history of America from 1880 to 1920 or so. And then after 1920s, you do get a Republican Gilded Age resurgence under, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, very corrupt initial stages under Harding. But even Hoover is running as the heir of the progressives. And then when the Great Depression comes, Roosevelt comes in and he takes the entire progressive agenda off the shelf and promptly begins to implement it and other stuff as fast as possible. We haven't had anything like that over the past 30 years. And here I'm simply going to throw up my hands and say it's a great mystery to me. That as an economic historian, I like to look at economic patterns and political economic patterns from the past, and to say we should learn from these and generalize them, and they provide some insight into the future and the present. And I would say that in general, we're extraordinarily successful. That there are lots of lessons to be drawn from the first stage of globalization from the second. There are lots of lessons to be drawn from the education of the high schoolization of America, for the collegeization of America, and for education elsewhere in the world. There are lots and lots of lessons to be drawn from the Great Depression for today. But the political economy of Gilded Ages, why the first Gilded Age produces a populist progressivist reaction and the second so far does not, there I throw up my hands and say that my economic historian training betrays me, and I have no clue as to what's going on here.
With that, I just want to say, before turning it over to Oscar and then very briefly to Brad, that we will be continuing this conversation across the hemisphere next Monday with Paul Pearson, who's a professor of political science and the co-author of Winner Take All Society here at Berkeley, and Danielle Hochman at the University of Chile, the School of Business and Economics.
And Paul's going to be talking about the 0.01%.
Oscar, very briefly, if you could leave us with a thought.
Yeah, just to finish very briefly with a whack at the same question. I think that what you observe here, it could be that you're observing in the United States, is the importance of the population understanding what you're doing, in a sense. So maybe in the previous Gilded Age, some people came up with plausible ways of facing the problem that became credible. After time, maybe they didn't. And the problem I see with the current trends in indignation are that, okay, people are angry and they occupy things and this, but we haven't really seen leadership come out with plausible directions to go, aggressive, plausible directions to go. So after a while, your indignation sort of, gets sort of diluted in the your general sort of life, and you can't go on. So at the end, I think that in a way we're missing some sort of political leadership and sort of that enables people to construct solutions to this problem. I think that one should look, and just let me finish with this, one should look at the experience of post-war Britain. The country wanted to be more egalitarian, but they didn't want to become the Soviet Union, okay? And the Labour Party, with a leader called Clement Attlee, came up with a solution for that, and it wasn't obvious. And that sort of thing hasn't come up yet. So I think that we're sort of trapped waiting for, in a sense, the next Clement Attlee. That's what I think.
Brad?
Well, I think I've talked more than my share. So let me just say that we all hope that Chile's experiment in, say, ramping up its educational system rapidly over a short time does have a very good outcome. Because it is a possible road to growth with substantial inequality, or with substantial equality, which is very difficult to achieve in a country that not only starts with the burden of latifundia, but also with the burden of not Dutch disease, but Chilean flu as well. And turn it back over to Oscar. And thank you very much for inviting me here today.
I think, unfortunately, we're about out of time. I'd like to thank everyone in Chile, everyone here at Berkeley, and this is not the end of the conversation, the beginning, to be continued. Thank you.